Welcome to Momentum for Change, Voices of the Missouri Movement. This is a monthly podcast produced by your coalition, and I am your host, Nora Mosby, a member services specialist at the Missouri Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence. We hope that you enjoyed this conversation coming to you directly from Voices of the Missouri Movement. Some episodes of Momentum for Change have conversations that include content and descriptions of domestic and sexual violence, which may be alarming or activating for some listeners. Please take care and visit the MOCADSV website or call our office to connect with supportive services. This is your host, Nora Mosby, and I'd like to welcome you to the first episode of a brand new season of Momentum for Change. This is season 5 of the podcast, and we are looking forward to the many voices of the Missouri movement that we plan to bring you throughout this new season. I'm especially looking forward to our conversation today. As many of our listeners will be aware, January is National Stalking Awareness Month, and in recognition, we are bringing you a conversation specifically about cyberstalking. The Missouri General Assembly recently passed a law convening the Stop Cyberstalking and Harassment Task Force. It is a mouthful, but there's a lot that this group has been up to. And throughout 2025, they met and developed recommendations to address cyberstalking in Missouri. So for our conversation today, we are joined by 2 members of this task force, Missouri State Senator Tracy McCreery and Heidi Coleman, Member Services Director at the Missouri Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence. Senator McCreery and Heidi, thank you so much for being here. I cannot wait to hear what this task force has been up to. As we're getting started, Senator McCreery, would you like to introduce yourself? Let us know a little bit about what you're up to.
I will do that. Hi, everybody. I'm State Senator Tracy McCreery. I'm a state senator in St. Louis County. My state senate district runs up and down Interstate 270, basically, in what kind of feels like the suburbs of St. Louis County. So I've got Maryland Heights, Creve Coeur, Ladue, Kirkwood, Glendale, Sunset Hills. I also go out a little bit on Highway 44. I've got Valley Park and Fenton. So I have an amazing state senate district. I'm honored to be in the state senate. Before I became a state senator in 2022, I served 9 years in the Missouri House of Representatives. And before that, I served as a district aide to former State Senator Joan Bray. So I've been in the building in many different capacities for quite a while. I have a business background. So before I kind of became an elected official, I worked in the pharmaceutical and healthcare industry. So I have a business background, and I mention that because a lot of my work in the state capitol, I kind of look at through my business lens.
Interesting. Well, I can't wait to hear more about your perspective on things. But before we get into that, Heidi, would you like to introduce yourself next?
Hi, I'm Heidi Coleman. I'm the Member Services Director at the Missouri Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence. I've been in the movement for about 21 years now, worked at a local program, and then in the last 6 years have been at the coalition.
Wonderful. Well, in addition to your work in government, Senator McCreery, you also really have carried a torch, I feel like, for survivors of domestic and sexual violence in particular. And this really, I think, sets you aside, and you kind of shine as a lawmaker for that reason. Can you just tell us a little bit about your perspective of being a lawmaker and why you've chosen to prioritize supporting survivors of domestic and sexual violence?
Well, I'm really glad you asked that, because one of the reasons I decided to run for office years ago was because of my experiences in volunteering at Safe Connections. I started out, they had what kind of felt like a young professionals committee at Safe Connections, which is St. Louis's oldest domestic violence and sexual assault organization. And I kind of worked my way up as a volunteer to being on the board, and I even chaired the board for a couple of years. So I learned a lot as a volunteer there. I remember talking to our executive director at the time, Susan Kidder, who we were talking about things like cyber stalking and being able to track people's cars by putting devices on and things like that. Now, mind you, that was 16 years ago or more. And we knew at the time that we didn't know what we didn't know, and that the people that are perpetrating violence or stalking, that they knew way more about the technology and things available to them than we did as a nonprofit. So it's always been something that I have been passionate about. I also, when I was in college, I was sexually assaulted by somebody that I used to work with. And so it took me many, many years to be able to talk about that and share that. But I truly believe that our life experiences are what make us really good lawmakers and public policy makers. And what drives me to be an elected official is I want to be able to use my voice to speak and stand up for those that maybe haven't found the words and can't say things out loud about things that are happening to them. And so I just try really hard. Sometimes my voice shakes, sometimes I get tears in my eyes, but it's an honor to actually be able to speak up for survivors of relationship violence and sexual assault.
I totally feel you on that. I'm getting tears in my eyes as you speak. So thank you so much for sharing that. I'm so sorry that happened to you. But wow, like that you have just carried the torch for other survivors and supported efforts to end domestic and sexual violence since then is such an incredible way, I think, to right that wrong and know that you are making a difference for other survivors. So thank you
It's
so much for sharing
Mhm.
that. So, in addition to your volunteer work, your work with Safe Connections, you have also, over your time as a state representative and a state senator, been very involved in supporting legislation, sponsoring legislation that supports survivors of domestic and sexual violence. Can you give us some examples of some of those? Because
Yeah.
they're really exciting to hear about.
Well, I appreciate that. And, one of the interesting things about the Missouri legislature is we do have term limits. So it's really important for the work that we do that we're always bringing in new people into our partnerships, into our coalitions. I don't know if any of you have run track, but I think about this, in track, you've got the relay. So you've got 4 people on a relay team and you've got the baton. I have the baton right now. I'm running my laps around the track, but pretty soon my time to run will be over. And it's up to me as a leader and a mentor to be cultivating people that can take that baton after me and keep moving forward, especially with issues like relationship violence and sexual assault. They remain things that are still hard for people to talk about. So I need to do everything I can now to lay the groundwork so that when I hand the baton off to somebody else, that they feel equally confident about talking about these things, because our work is too important for us to have a lull where we don't have anybody moving forward. So that's one of my philosophies in this work. And I was really fortunate. State Senator Jill Shoup I took her place in the state Senate. She mentored me and handed off a lot of her amazing pieces of legislation. And she connected me with a lot of people that she'd connected with through the years. And so that's why I kind of inherited this Stop Cyberstalking and Harassment Task Force. So that was how that got going in the legislature. It was something that Senator Jill Shoup worked on and was quite passionate about. But I had another big victory last year, and it was a bipartisan victory, passed nearly unanimously in both the House and the Senate, and that was raising the age of marriage in the state of Missouri to 18. And that was a big victory. It took us several years to get that done. Sometimes in the work we do, we don't have data that supports our work. We just have to kind of trust our guts. But the interesting thing about marriage is we do have data because these county clerks record things. And so we are able to see that there were situations where 16 and 17-year-olds were marrying people that were much older. And that was something that I thought had to stop. And the reason I mentioned 16 or 17-year-olds is because several years before, in theory, we didn't even have a minimum age of marriage. And so we raised it up a little bit. And so then we raised it and said, basically, if you were under 16, you couldn't get married. But we still had this weird loophole where 16 or 17-year-olds could get married. And this is a challenging thing for politicians to do sometimes. We had to admit that we didn't fix the problem and that we didn't address the problem as thoroughly as we needed to. So we had to come back and close that loophole. And now it's, you have to be 18 to get married, period. And I'm really proud of my colleagues for being able to say, you know what, we didn't quite get that right. We have further work to do. So I was really proud of that. And again, that was a bipartisan effort. It had support from Republicans and Democrats, and I'm really, really proud of that. Not everything that we work on relating to your issues, we don't always have success with things, but that doesn't mean that we don't try to raise awareness and still try to get things done. So I will just share one of the things that is perpetually frustrating to me is when Missouri became a constitutional carry state relating to firearms in 2016. We, I would say unintentionally, a cynical person might say that it was intentional, but we created a problem for survivors of relationship violence in that we have this, in the state of Missouri, we have this deadly domestic violence loophole as it relates to guns being able to stay in the possession of someone that's an abuser. So I still am going to try to fix that and close that. When that bill passed in 2016, uh, leadership in the House told us, promised us that we would come back and fix that. And it's been 10 years now, and we have not, as a body, the legislature has not closed that deadly domestic violence loophole. But I remain committed to trying to do that. I want to share that because I don't want people to think that we just have success after success after success. We have more failures than successes. And I just wanted to share both a success and something I'm continuing to work on.
No, I really appreciate you speaking to that. I think our hopes and dreams here at the coalition is to see a domestic violence firearms law. And we're so thankful that you are willing to carry that baton forward. And we'll get there someday,
It
right?
will.
It might not be next year, it might not be the year after that, but someday, as long as
Mhm.
we have champions like you continuing to carry the baton. So thank you. And thank you so much also for speaking to the new raising the age of marriage in the state of Missouri. That was a very celebratory win. Speaking of data, we know that domestic violence and the risk for other harm does increase significantly for those child marriages. So
Mhm.
thanks for speaking to that.
Happy to do it.
Yeah. Heidi, I would like to turn it over to you a little bit. This is the Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence. And we don't always necessarily think of stalking as an issue that fits into domestic and sexual violence, but I'm willing to bet that you would argue that, in fact, it does. So, can you speak to the coalition's role in addressing stalking specifically and kind of what the relationship is there between stalking and domestic and sexual violence?
Yeah, absolutely. So we always joke about we love wheels and domestic violence and sexual violence advocacy work.
It's a
So
nod to the power and control wheel.
yeah. And the power and control wheel has so many different layers within it that show the different ways that perpetrators will take power away from somebody so that they can control them. Stalking is one of those layers within domestic violence and sexual assault. And so that is where we come in at because it is part of a domestic violence situation, and it's also part of a sexual assault situation because the stalking could have led up to the sexual assault or happened after the sexual assault, and the same way with domestic violence as well.
Yeah, so I think that's such an interesting point. Maybe even when stalking is happening outside of an intimate partner relationship, as a matter of preventing sexual assault from happening, when you support survivors of stalking, you could be potentially intervening, providing safety planning and support before a sexual assault happens. And
Yes, because
so,
the lethality of a situation increases when there is stalking involved. And so that can be with somebody that you don't know. And so the stalking then increases, or it could be somebody that you do know and where that does increase it.
mhm. Yep. I think in the overwhelming majority of domestic violence homicides, we certainly see that stalking has occurred before that homicide happened. So I know a lot to talk about there, but Senator McCreery, were you going to say something to that?
Yeah, I wanted to share that I before I started working on this, I had a myth that was busted as it relates to this. I kind of naively thought that the cyber stalking and harassment would be from somebody that you know, and I just assumed it would be like an ex or a former partner or something. And I met with and talked with survivors, victims of cyber stalking who had no idea who their stalker was. They had no idea what he or she looked like. They didn't know if they lived on the same block, the same state, or is it somebody from overseas? And that I wanted to admit that because I think that's one of the challenges with addressing crimes like this is there are a lot of misunderstandings about it. And I think it would be even more terrifying to not know what the person looked like. I would, how would you know? Is it somebody that you're just passing in the grocery store? To me, that sounds extra scary.
Yeah, I think a lot of people share that understanding of what stalking is and that there's often a relationship there. And you're so right. Sometimes there's not. And the issue is, Heidi and I were just talking about this earlier. The issue is that if there's not that intimate partner relationship, if there hasn't been a sexual assault, then there's not advocacy services available for survivors of stalking in Missouri. And so it's really critical that domestic and sexual violence advocates recognize that stalking is part of their work to end violence. Because, in fact, domestic and sexual violence advocates have the tools and services that survivors of stalking need. They know about safety planning, they know about how to access the legal systems, orders of protection. And so there is a huge opportunity for domestic and sexual violence advocates to support survivors when there isn't and when there isn't a relationship in a stalking situation. So there's a lot to unpack with this discussion today. There really is. But before we get ahead of ourselves, I would like to just start with a basic definition of cyberstalking. What is it that we're talking about here? What are just kind of some common dynamics of cyberstalking? What is
Yeah.
this issue?
Well, and so for folks that are interested, there is a 2025 annual report that came from the Stop Cyberstalking and Harassment Task Force. Pretty early on in our work, we realized we needed to have kind of a common definition that we were all working from because I even found myself sort of getting a little bit away from the core definition. And it's exactly what we've just been talking about is it's very complex. There's many, many layers. And so the basic definition that we were working from as a task force, it's the use of digital technology, internet service providers or electronic service providers to enhance the ability to stalk, intimidate, harass, track, follow, or cause fear, anxiety, undue stress, or terror to others. So you can see there's a lot of different tools at the stalker's disposal. And then I think what's important when we're talking about like victim services and how the judicial branch and law enforcement responds, this is the type of conduct that's threatening, aggressive, or otherwise fear inducing and involves an invasion of the person's relative right to privacy. And then it manifests in repeated actions over time. So, that is the definition that we have been working with. And I think it does a good job of kind of encompassing what we're trying to deal with. But I bet if we had the same podcast 10 years from now, there would probably be some different things added in. It's an ever evolving kind of crime.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I have to say, I've been thinking and talking about online stalking for quite a while as I've been working throughout this movement and working to support survivors. But I never thought about it in terms of actually enhancing the ability to perpetrate stalking behaviors.
Hmm.
And you're right, there is almost this kind of added element of fear, increased access to a potential victim that exists when it goes online. And I just think that's important to recognize, that maybe the trauma could be even more severe because it's happening online,
Yeah.
in interesting ways I
Well,
hadn't thought
and
about.
and it also means like we heard from some survivors who filled out our survey, you can't move away from it sometimes. Like, you can't move to another state. Oftentimes the person can find you. So it's like, how do you get away from it? It's like, I would suspect that some people want to just like not even have a phone, not have internet access, nothing, to just try to totally get away from that. But in the world we live in, you pretty much have to have those things to participate in society and the economy. So yeah, it's very, very complex.
Yeah, yeah. I'm so glad you spoke to that. Anything else you would add to that, Heidi?
Well, thinking about like how technology changes throughout, like within a year, really, honestly, it's not just we have Alexas in our home. We have smart TVs, we have smart devices that can add to that enhanced perpetration of of those stalking events. And so it really does take on more of a nuance than just I'm getting threatening text messages and threatening emails or something like that. There is these whole other layers now that also impact that cyber stalking and harassment as well.
Well,
And
and it's much easier for the stalkers to use these like spoofed phone numbers. So, like pretty much if a phone call comes in on my phone and it's a 314 area code, I just assume it's like a neighbor or a friend trying to reach me and that I just don't have that number in my address book. So, the ability and the ease, and I think they're practically free now to do these spoofed calls, that also makes it really hard. Can you imagine if someone was stalking you and harassing you in your workplace, but yet you need to answer the phone as part of your job, but this person could be using spoof numbers to get you to answer his call? I mean, it's very, very complex. And so, one of our recommendations from the task force is to give law enforcement tools that would criminalize the act of spoofed calls.
interesting. Yeah, as you both were talking about the definition, I was thinking with this enhanced perpetration of stalking behaviors online, it calls for an enhanced response.
Hmm.
And so I think you're very just describing the urgency of the cyber stalking and harassment task force so perfectly. I get it. This needed to happen.
Yeah. It needed to happen. And before, I want to make sure that I give a huge shout out to Heidi Coleman. I'm honored that she's on this podcast with me. I am not kidding when I say this report that I'm working from would not be the quality that it is without Heidi's work. You can tell she's just a gifted coalition builder. She was herding cats. We had, prosecutors and judges and law enforcement. We had the Noah's Ark approach to a task force, and Heidi Coleman was able to get everybody to get their work done and to meet deadlines and everything else. So I just want to give a shout out to Heidi for all of the work she did. And, this was all due right before the Christmas holiday, and Heidi managed to get people to get things done. It was pretty impressive.
I tell you, Heidi certainly can and does get things done. Thank you so much for your leadership on the task force,
Thank
Heidi.
you. Thank you. I appreciate that.
So, I'd like to talk more about some of the dynamics of cyber stalking. I would like to know kind of who is being impacted. Of course, we know cyber stalking probably happens to just about everybody, people from every walk of life, every background. However, I would also assume that it doesn't happen to everybody in the same way, and some groups maybe are more vulnerable or experience higher rates of cyber stalking than others. Is there anything you would add to that?
Well, we did have a survey that was put together by a professor from Southeast Missouri State University. It was really well done. We did get a good volume of responses from our survey that is pretty Missouri specific. 85% of the online harassment and stalking victims identified as female, so it is heavily female, but there are men out there as well that can be victimized. And then the age range is really interesting. It's just about every age you can imagine, but it does hit heavily in that age, 25 to 64. But I have to say part of it could be that only you know people in that age group know how to get online and fill out a survey and that kind of thing too. So it's certainly not a scientifically rigorous study, but it gives us a great snapshot of the impact in our communities. Besides it being a survey where you can check boxes and it's kind of rigid response, we did have a way for people to write what they were feeling and thinking and such. And that's what's really stuck with me and kind of kept me awake at night, quite honestly. Some survivor said she reported things to social media platforms, but they failed to remove the content. Another survivor said that law enforcement didn't take her report seriously, and that she moved multiple times and her stalker still found her. I think the thing that was most interesting to me is that the high percentage of victims that are extremely traumatized by this. So in our survey, 97% of the victims reported experiencing stress or anxiety as a result of the victimization. So it's certainly not something that just happens and they go about their day. 94% of the victims reported experiencing emotional distress as a result of the victimization. So this is definitely something that is significantly impacting people's lives. And that's why I'm really glad we got this task force together. And although we have this report, we're still going to be convening throughout 2026. So we'll certainly be able to take more input from the community and further refine our recommendations.
Yeah, I think there's so many opportunities that you all have identified for positive change to happen. It's pretty exciting. When you talk about the demographics of cyber stalking, I do just want to point out like you really are also seeing the same demographics in domestic and sexual violence. Yes, it can happen to everyone, but it happens to some groups more than others. Heidi, what were you going to say?
So, one of the things that was highlighted into the survey is a need for this response in rural areas. We had a significant amount of responses from rural Missouri, and it really showed that it's not just happening in our large cities. It is happening in little towns in Missouri, and it's also happening to folks that are going to higher education as well. So that was the other thing that was part of that survey that we had seen, is that folks that had attended college were also being stalked and cyber stalked and harassed at higher levels than other folks. So there is a different kind of dynamic too in that, because even with me, I was thinking it was more of like your urban areas that were experiencing it, but it was a significant amount in our rural areas.
That's so interesting. It's almost like the more we talk about it, the more complex I'm seeing
But
how
I
this
will
issue
say,
is.
I'm always looking for an opportunity. This should make it a little easier for us that care about this issue to get some legislation passed, because I'm going to reach out to my colleagues that represent rural areas and say, hey, this is impacting your constituents too. So there is a benefit in knowing this information. Information is power, that's for sure.
The more you know, the more you can do. Absolutely. So we've talked about some of the harm that happens from cyber stalking, like the mental health impact, just the living with fear is so extreme. The trauma is so extreme. But is there also a risk with cyber stalking of it turning into interpersonal violence that happens in person? Is there anything you would say about that?
I'll let Heidi go. She's in touch with so many more of your member organizations.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I was saying earlier, like it is an increase of the lethality of a situation. In an order of protection, it says if you're followed from place to place, or even if you have a third party communication, that is part of the cyber stalking and harassment, is that third party, because they could be going through like Facebook or something like that to get in touch to really control that situation, especially when we talk about the anxiety and the stress that somebody has. um, and even like 72% of people were saying that they had difficulty focusing, and also they made social media changes. Like they were blocking people. That's usually like the first response. Well, if you don't like that somebody is contacting you, block them. It was around 80% of the folks said that they did block the person that was blocking them online. And it's not stopping it. They're just finding other ways to do it.
I think it's for a survivor or somebody that's being victimized, you just don't know what's next. So one of the survivors that I talked to came home one day and her kitchen drawer that had knives in it was on her bed. So someone had been in her home and took a drawer with knives and moved it. And I mean, like, was that her stalker? Was it like another? It's just like I can't imagine what it would be like to go through your days like that, to not know that you might come into your home, the place that should be your safe place, and to think that somebody was there and it was really just psychologically messing with you. So I think that's probably what makes some of this even more terrifying for people is you just don't know what's next and how it's going to escalate.
Right, the unpredictability of it all is even more
Yep.
fear-inducing. So Heidi mentioned orders of protection, and there are currently some laws and protections in place for people who are experiencing cyber stalking here in Missouri. Could you talk about what some of those protections are? What can someone do? What recourse does somebody currently have who's experiencing cyber stalking?
Well, it's kind of hit or miss out there right now. And I think that's one of the frustrations that survivors have is, that not everybody that they come into contact with understands what they're going through. And then even if they do, they're not quite sure what the next step would be. So a lot of what this task force is recommending is that we need to make sure there needs to be a community awareness building. So there has to be an awareness campaign that's kind of age appropriate for K to 12 students that are in higher ed situations, and then, adults out there as well, including paying attention to those that are older Missourians, older Americans as well. They have some special situations that could put them at risk for other things. But a lot of what we kept coming back to as a group is that um, it's almost depends on who picks up the phone when you call 911 or when you decide to go into a police station and ask for help. It's hit or miss on if people are going to understand what's going on. So we're going to need to do a lot of training for our first responders, but then also through the judicial branch as well. And I'm really thankful that we had, some judges and prosecutors and others involved on the task force because there's also going to be a need for a lot of education in the judicial branch as well.
Yeah, I think it's such a challenging issue sometimes for law enforcement to address because so much of our law enforcement response is based on a single incident
Mhm.
and responding to a single incident. But when it comes to online stalking, we're talking about multiple incidents over time that, when taken together and understanding the fear that somebody is experiencing, then crosses the line to become illegal or to allow someone to be eligible for an order of protection. But if you just look at that one event, it may or may not even be illegal,
Well, and
right?
how many of us, like, I've had some terrible things texted to me or sent to me on a messaging through social media, and I delete it because it's so gross. And then I'm like, oh my gosh, like, why did I delete that? Like, I should keep it. So some of this awareness is like, making sure that people know that although you're repulsed by something, it is evidence and it could be helpful. And so, there's just a lot of education that has to happen. No, but there's no one in Missouri that's intentionally not wanting to help survivors or to help victims. And, our job is to not be pointing fingers at anybody, but to say, hey, the world is very different now than it was when you went through schooling and your training. And we just need to get people up to date on the ways of the world.
Right, right, right. And yeah, I think part of that education will help with maybe some of the minimizing and normalizing that's happening with stalking behaviors and maybe help people connect the dots between how these incidents could really cause somebody to be afraid
Mhm.
for their safety. So we've talked a little bit about the Stop Cyber Stalking and Harassment Task Force. And I just want to dive into that now. So it was passed from some legislation in the 2024 legislative session, something that you sponsored, Senator McCreery, I believe. And it was passed into Missouri law in section 565.258. And that established this Stop Cyber Stalking and Harassment Task Force. So you talked a little bit about how you inherited this law from a previous state senator. Is there anything else you would like to add about kind of the process of getting it passed into law? Any advocacy that you did in the state senate to get that to happen?
Well, I am pleased to report things like this don't make the news, but I had a lot of support from colleagues in both the House and the Senate, and from Republicans and Democrats. It's truly a bipartisan issue. Just about everybody that I talked to during that legislative session was aware of somebody that had experienced something. And so, just like how we used to be with sexual assault and domestic violence, I'm old enough to remember when we didn't talk about those things. We're slowly getting better at talking about those things. I think the fact that cyber stalking victims are more comfortable sharing their experiences, it's actually helpful to society and to the community. So, I'm this wouldn't have happened. This bill wouldn't have passed without the support of my colleagues in the majority party, and I really appreciate that. I also really appreciate working with law enforcement on this because, I can't imagine what it would be like to be a first responder, to be in law enforcement. Well, for one thing, from minute to minute, you have no idea what's coming your way, what you're going to be seeing or hearing or dealing with. And, we're just putting more and more on law enforcement. And I just appreciate their leadership and willingness to say, hey, when I went through the academy, we didn't even have the internet when I went through the academy. And now we need to learn and need to stay up on things. So I appreciate everybody coming at this with a good attitude. We're not pointing fingers, trying to make people feel bad about their responses. It's just all of us acknowledging that we're dealing with some new things.
Yeah, I think a multidimensional issue like this certainly benefits from a multidisciplinary response. So, definitely seeing the need for that with the task force. Although it wasn't specified in the state law, the task force really set out with a needs assessment, that survey you all have been talking about to kind of assess what's going on with cyberstalking Missouri. I thought it was a really powerful way to launch the work of the task force. Can you tell us more about the survey and how you all came to that decision?
Go ahead, Heidi.
Yeah, I'll go ahead on that one. So we kind of fall in line with how the Sexual Assault Bill of Rights folks had gotten their information, and they had started with a survey. And they had gotten a huge amount back on that. So we were like, let's try this and see what kind of response we could get. We and and we were really blessed with having a professor on the task force, and she took the lead. Her and her team took the lead to draft that up, and from there it was just so great because we were able to get a huge response. I'm thinking we had over 100 or so folks.
That is
Um,
huge for a voluntary survey.
Right.
yes, and we had got the information out on so many different platforms. And I believe we did like a Facebook ad. Like we've got ads on social media to promote it. We also promoted it within news organizations to get the information out there. There was even some of the task force that did interviews during those news broadcasts to really get the point across and to get those responses in. That was super great to have that many responses. And we didn't give folks a huge amount of time to get the survey in, but it was enough that we were 109 folks is what we got. It was a group effort of trying to get the information. I know we were sending it out to our members. Law enforcement was sending it out. I know Department of Public Safety also had sent it out as well. So we had pretty much everybody within the task force send it to their listservs of who they could get to fill it out.
Yeah, I love it. And Senator McCreery, you already mentioned that it included quotes from survivors. And I thought that made it so powerful is that, yes, you had this kind of qualitative information, but then you also had just really thoughtful feedback from people who had experienced cyber stalking.
Yeah, I've never
So,
worked on the front end of a survey development like this. Dr. Monica Radu, RADU, from Southeast Missouri State, led the charge on this. I mean, the state of Missouri owes her a huge thank you. This survey was top notch. Like it was really good, and it went through several drafts because we wanted to make sure we were, using consistent language and things like that too. It was extremely helpful. And the fact that it was, survey was only open from July 1st to mid-September, and so it was a short turnaround time, but because of that, it allows us to be thoughtful in our report that was due by the end of the year. It wasn't us just in an abstract manner guessing what we needed. We were able to look at feedback from actual survivors and respond.
And you all developed recommendations, a very comprehensive set of recommendations around justice system response, legislative action, and public awareness.
Mhm.
Senator McCreery, you already mentioned some of the steps for greater public awareness that you all called for. Is there anything more you all would like to share about your recommendations around justice system response and legislative action? Anything you'd like to say about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, we could do several podcasts on this, quite honestly. I'll
Yes.
talk a little bit about the legislative recommendations. We have to create cyberstalking and harassment criminal offenses. There's no way around that. We're going to have to modernize our statutes. We're going to also have to um, give authority to law enforcement to use different types of methods to be able to unmask these perpetrators that are using spoofing and things like that. We're going to also have to take a hard look at what we're doing to support survivors. For example, we could make them eligible for that Safe at Home program, which is an address confidentiality program. We could update VESA to include those survivors. Um, Another interesting thing we're going to have to do is we have to acknowledge that sometimes these are crimes that cross state lines or even international lines. So we're going to have to do some work within our criminal code to make sure that we're doing everything we can so that if things cross jurisdictions, that prosecutors and law enforcement has the tools that they need. And then, of course, just about like anything in the world that I can imagine, there's got to be some funding available. So we're going to have to be very creative with how we can get together funding to enable law enforcement to have additional training. The judicial branch is going to want some tools and additional training as well. And of course, the public awareness campaign is going to take funding as well. So I'm not naive. I know I've got my work cut out for me, but this is an issue that is really important and is impacting a lot of Missourians' lives. And I think we'll be able to rally the troops and get some good things done.
Yeah. I did say it was
Yes,
comprehensive. There
thank
is
you.
a
Yeah.
lot to it.
I think maybe
Yes.
I'll let Heidi talk a little bit. I feel like I kind of ran through some of the legislative things. There's a lot of other recommendations as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So we were talking about like how much evidence is collected for cyber stalking. And so really training law enforcement of what does that fact pattern look like? What needs to be collected, how they need to incorporate that into a case. And then bringing that over to prosecutors, and then how do you prosecute that? And then also getting training for judges so that they understand the different um, the different ways that cyber stalking does impact somebody and what they need to do from there. So it really incorporates all of the different systems within the judicial system itself. And then also training advocates, making sure that they understand how the law works and that they can also be with somebody at court, either in the criminal process or the civil process. The other one I want to make sure that we do hit on is about Title IX integration with our colleges and universities, because you do see off campus cyber stalking that's happening. And so making sure that they are equipped to be able to handle that.
Yeah.
Well, this has been such a productive task force, y'all. And I know you were only tasked to work for a year, but I think it was such a positive and productive group that I understand you'll be continuing into the future. So can you talk about future plans of the task force?
Well, we've already got our next meeting set up. I really appreciate the commitment that everybody has shown to this. And this was, I mean, we had some pretty serious, tough conversations, quite honestly. And you know what? Like, I appreciate that people care enough about this issue, that professionals that have been named to this task force want to do what's right for Missourians. And I really appreciate that. The Department of Public Safety is who housed, kind of like they function as the administrative arm for this task force. I really enjoyed working with them. We have a new director there, Mark James, and Mark and his team, I felt so welcome. They sort of feel like family to me at this point. So it's been a really positive experience. And, to me, these are things that don't get enough tension in Missouri, things that are going right and people that are trying to make a difference and do the right thing. So I really appreciate the opportunity to kind of highlight some of these things that are happening.
Wonderful. I cannot wait to see what you all end up doing with continued time together. Whenever we bring a new issue onto the podcast to talk about, I always like to ask our guests to share any favorite resources that you have related to the issue. So, for someone who's looking for more information around cyber stalking, do you have any favorite resources that you would recommend or kind of point people to?
Yeah, absolutely. So Spark, SPARC, they are a wealth of information, and it's stalkingawareness.org. You can get to them, and they have all types of information, such as like identifying stalking behavior, a risk assessment, and safety planning. They also show documentation and logs of how to log if you are being cyber stalked. The other one that I do want to talk about, and they are part of the task force, is the Missouri Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force. It's MOICAC.org, and they do all of the cyber crime work that you do hear about in the state of Missouri. Their focus is on children, but they do handle other cyber crimes as well.
And for our podcast listeners out there, Dana Flightman from Spark was actually a guest on the Momentum for Change podcast in January 2024. So we will add all of the resources that Heidi mentioned and the link to that podcast episode in our show notes. Tracy, is there anything you'd add to that?
No, I'm impressed with all of the members of the coalition, of your coalition around the state of Missouri. They truly are doing the Lord's work. Some of them, are extremely underfunded. I know with January being Stalking Awareness Month, the organization that I'm connected to, Safe Connections, has done several social media posts with resources like Heidi was mentioning. So, what I would say if someone's listening to this podcast, I would say pick your favorite local service provider, no matter what part of the state you live in. Give them a follow on social media. You'll be really impressed with the resources that they provide. People like us, you just never know when someone's going to reach out for help. And I feel like it's our job as Missourians and Americans to be able to have tools at our fingertips so that we can get people pointed in the right direction.
I could not agree more. There are incredible, inspiring advocacy agencies throughout the state of Missouri who are working each and every day to support survivors and ensure the safety of our communities. So, big shout out to you all, advocacy agencies. Thank you for what you do. As we're wrapping up, I do want to end by saying, January is National Stalking Awareness Month. And so, when you think about awareness, is there anything that either of you would say that you kind of wish that there was more awareness of when it comes to cyber stalking in particular?
Gosh, I guess it's what we would say to a lot of people that encounter a survivor or someone that's going through a tough time. We need to actually believe people and listen to them. And just because someone might not be able to show us 30 texts of terrible things that are being said, if they feel terrorized and they're scared and they're fearful, it's up to us to believe them and support them and help them in whatever way they're asking for our help. So, we all just need to try to put ourselves in the other person's shoes. And if they're comfortable enough talking about this to somebody, we need to lend them a serious ear and take them seriously.
I agree 100%. Heidi, how about you?
Absolutely. That is probably the first and foremost thing is start by believing somebody that's going through this. There is a lot of information that a person will gather because there's multiple events. And sometimes it's a lot of stuff, but a lot of stuff has happened. So really start by believing.
Yeah, I think one of the things I was kind of catching on to as you all were talking about some of the dynamics of cyberstalking is that it does feel very unreal, I think by design. Like perpetrators are I think, using abuse tactics that do seem unbelievable, that cause survivors to question their reality. And that's by design and intentional. And so, yes, it's very important that we believe survivors. All right. Well, thank you all so much for your amazing advocacy. Any final thoughts as we're closing out the episode?
Nope. I just want to say it's an honor to be in the same coalition, the same corner with all of you. I really, I'm honored.
Right back at you, Senator McCreery. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us for this conversation today, Heidi and Senator McCreery. I learned so much. I'm so inspired by your work on the task force. Thank you so much for all you did. And thank you, listeners, for tuning in. We really appreciate it. Can't wait to bring you another episode of Momentum for Change next month. And until then, we'll see you later. Thank you for joining us. This has been a recorded conversation now available in both video and podcast formats. A video recording of this episode is available on the MOCADSV YouTube channel under the Momentum for Change playlist. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel in order to receive new episodes in your YouTube feed. You can also find all of our Momentum for Change episodes available to stream on Spotify or wherever you find your podcasts. Momentum for Change is a podcast produced by MOCADSV with post-production support provided by Tim Stillings and promotion by Adrian Maddox. Again, I am your host, Nora Mosby, and we appreciate you joining us for this episode. Thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you next month.